Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and the panel, I'll say on behalf of both of them that we're all happy to be here, and we're grateful to be here as well. I'd like to introduce Adam McKible. Adam is an associate professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He teaches courses in American and African American literature. He's the co-editor of a special issue, Modernism, Modernity, devoted to the Harlem Renaissance, which was published in 2013, and of little magazines in modernism, New Approaches, in 2007. And he edited and introduced Edward Christopher Williams When Washington Was in Vogue, a previously lost novel of Harlem Renaissance. He is also the author of Space and Place of Modernism, The Russian Revolution, Little Magazines, and New York. His essays on little magazines, modernism, and African American literature appear in the Oxford Handbook of Modernisms, Teaching the Harlem Renaissance, Course Design, and Classroom Strategies, The Black Press, African American Review, Contemporary Literature Criticism, the Dictionary of Literature Biography, American Periodicals, and various dictionaries and encyclopedias. His current project is tentatively titled George Horace Lorimer and the Harlem Renaissance. Please welcome him.
So first, thank you from the bottom of my heart to the organizers of this conference for giving me an excuse to come to Provence. It's very nice here.
Yeah.
And I'm having a great time. So the title of this paper is The Saturday Evening Post in the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm looking at how, in general, how the Saturday Evening Post responded to sort of the rise of black modernism, black modernity in the early 20th century. And to cut to the chase, none of it's good. Irvin S. Cobb, Octavius Roy Cohen, and Hugh Wiley may not loom large in current studies of the Harlem Renaissance, but their influence on American culture was keenly felt at the time because these white authors were three of the most prominent writers of Negro dialect fiction published in the Saturday Evening Post in the 1920s. George Horace Lorimer, the magazine's editor from 1899 to 1936, had an enormous appetite for stereotypical dialect fiction and published such work on a near-monthly basis for decades. And because the Post was the largest circulation periodical in the U.S., the magazine's depictions of black life were a dominant feature of Jim Crow America and were, therefore, also an inevitable target of new Negro resistance. My current project examines the history of racist black caricatures during Lorimer's tenure at the Post, concentrating especially on Cohen, Wiley, and Cobb. For this talk, I focus on Cobb's novel, J. Poindexter Colored, which ran serially in the Post in 1922, and exemplifies various aspects of the Post's black dialect fiction. In particular, I examine Cobb's incorporation of tropes that would become critical to black modernist literature, including the Great Migration, the phenomenon of the New Negro, the persistence of the Old Negro, and the rise of Harlem as a modern black metropolis, all presented through the lenses of stereotype and minstrelsy that were in hot demand by readers of the Saturday Evening Post. Cobb's work fits snugly in the magazine's history of publishing formulaic dialect fiction, which recycled a predictable handful of motifs, themes, and flat characters. In addition to its emphasis on distorted language, some of the more prominent conventions of dialect fiction in the Post include black characters who are naive, childish, petty, and intellectually undeveloped. These characters are prone to thievery, chicanery, dishonesty, and deception, and they are characterized by vanity and excessive interest in sartorial splendor and hyper-consciousness about their social status in the black community. Good fortune comes to these characters by sheer accident, bad luck results from schemes gone awry, and many characters are all too commonly hoisted by their own petard. In other words, dialect fiction in the Post constitutes a static genre, one in which blackness becomes a form of commoditized knowledge that is reproduced endlessly with few variations. So just to make this idea clear, right? I did that really quickly, but there's really just a handful of ways that blackness is handled in the Post, and it just gets reused and reused and reused and reused over and over and over again. So this is to me is a static genre. Some things do change over the decades of Lorimer's editorship, however, for while the formal elements of this genre remain fairly constant, shifts in American and African American historical experience often find their ways into the fiction. This combination of sustained formal consistency and changing historical developments, I argue, register and recontain social change, by which I mean that dialect fiction in the post chronicles new historical developments, what we might call modernity, but then folds those developments back into older stereotypical forms of knowledge and racially stratified social norms and practices. So register the idea that you're going to take history and you're going to make note of it, but recontain, always bringing it back into this older form of knowledge, always moving it back toward sort of Jim Crow ways of thinking, and really antebellum constructions of race relations and blackness and whiteness. Cobb's serialized novel, J. Poindexter Color, is a perfect example of this dynamic of register and recontain. Like most of the writers who supplied Lorimer's dialect fiction, Irvin S. Cobb is now a mostly forgotten figure of literary history. Before his reputation started to decline in the late 1930s, however, Cobb enjoyed a level of fame in the early 20th century that rivaled fellow humorist Mark Twain's popularity in the 19th century. Beginning as a reporter for his hometown Kentucky newspaper, the Paducah Daily News, Cobb quickly became a very young managing editor as well as a correspondent for larger metropolitan papers. And then he moved to New York City in 1904, where he soon became the highest paid staff reporter on Joseph Pulitzer's New York Evening and Sunday World. Cobb started working for the Saturday Evening Post in 1909 when he wrote his first short story for the magazine. Once Lorimer began publishing Cobb regularly, the writer's status soared even higher. By his death in 1944, Cobb had published 60 books and more than 300 short stories. He had developed a robust presence on public lecture circuits, and he was a known commodity on the stage, behind the camera, and on the screen. So that's very condensed, but the idea is that Cobb was really a dominant feature of much of American mass popular culture. And I left off the whole bit about he was even on a cigar box. And he was not a pretty man, by the way, so getting into that cigar box took some work. Cobb often included black characters and black caricature in his work, but unlike his dialect writing peers, Cohen and Wiley, he only occasionally made African Americans the central focus of his writing for the Post. Instead, Cobb's fiction about Southern life primarily centers on a white character named Judge William Pittman Priest, a paunchy, rumpled, and quaint and slightly ridiculous Civil War veteran who uses his homespun wisdom to maintain order in Cobb's picturesque version of Paducah, which is imbued with nostalgia for the antebellum slaveholding South. But focusing on this white character was not Cobb's original intention. When he started writing his Paducah stories, Cobb planned to make the judge's faithful servant, Jeff Poindexter, the center of his fiction. According to a 1915 article in Pearson's magazine, so this is a quote, and it's a quote within a quote, "The stories were never intended at the start to center about Judge Priest. The big character was to have been Jeff, the smart Negro, but Judge Priest just naturally absorbed the spotlight and wouldn't be obscured." And here's Cobb. "I just couldn't keep that lazy nigger on the job," Cobb explained to some friends to whom he had outlined his original plan for the series, end quote. Cobb published over 20 Judge Priest stories in the Post before attempting to make Poindexter his protagonist. And here's how he moved to writing about Jeff Poindexter. In 1918, Lorimer sent Cobb to cover the war in Europe, suggesting to his reporter, quote, "I think there ought to be a good article in our Negro troops and stevedores abroad. They show up mighty well when they swing by over here," end quote. Following Lorimer's lead, Cobb traveled to the front, where he spent time with the African-American servicemen of the 369th Regiment, the now famous Harlem Hellfighters. His article for the Post, Young Black Joe, became an instant sensation and was widely reported, excerpted, and reproduced by periodicals across the U.S. The Louisville Courier-Journal, for example, excitedly announced that it would run Cobb's story, claiming, quote, "There is no man writing for the press today better qualified than Cobb to make such a report. He knows the Negroes as only a Southerner raised with them from boyhood and babyhood can know them. He knows both the Southern Negro and the Northern Negro," end quote. So this idea that was very popular in the press that, white Southerners know black people the way nobody else possibly can. And the Nashville Globe, a black paper, declared, quote, "No higher praise has been accorded the valiant Negro troops in the Great World War than by Irvin Cobb. In one of his recent articles in the Saturday Evening Post entitled Young Black Joe, Mr. Cobb gives a stirring account of how finely both the Negro draft and volunteer regiments have rendered their patriotic service, end quote. And there are lots of black newspapers that are reporting very favorably on Cobb's story. With such widespread approval for his treatment of modern African Americans, Cobb appears to have felt ready to write about his putatively lazy black character. After a flurry of correspondences with Lorimer, he published J. Poindexter Colored as a 4-part series in the Saturday Evening Post in June and July of 1922. The plot of Cobb's novel, which is told from the first-person perspective of its titular narrator, and actually this is very interesting. Most dialect stories are told in the third person, but this one is told from the first person of the black character written by the white author. So the plot of Cobb's novel is entirely formulaic and concerns Poindexter's ultimately successful efforts to save his younger, gullible white employer from the clutches of northern hucksters, who attempt to squeeze the employer for all he's worth and shame him into marrying a gold digger. The main plot is predictable from beginning to end. Nonetheless, the novel merits attention because of the historical details Cobb incorporates. J. Poindexter Colored addresses and to a certain extent anticipates a number of topics that would become primary concerns of African American writers of the Harlem Renaissance, including topics: the Great Migration, the advent of Harlem as a new urban black community, the coming of the post-World War I new Negro, the rise of Marcus Garvey, and the early burgeoning black film industry. Just as interestingly, Lorimer cut a number of chapters when he serialized Cobb's novel, which are editorial decisions worth considering. After an introductory chapter set down yonder, in the South, that emphasizes Poindexter's fidelity to the existing racial hierarchy and his adherence to the demands of the color line, Poindexter and his new employer, Dallas Pulliam, travel from Kentucky to New York by train. Cobb uses this journey to examine the changes being wrought by both the Great Migration and the advent of the new Negro. He exemplifies these phenomena through 2 Pullman porters named Harold and Gabe, who embody Cobb's ideas about blackness and modernity. Gabe, who is, quote, black as pots and powerful nappy-headed besides, represents Cobb's ideal of black humanity because he, Gabe, cheerfully adheres to the protocols of racial segregation, accepts the color line as natural, and, quote, knows what's service. Like Poindexter, Gabe is an ever-attentive, self-abnegating figure who anticipates his passengers' needs and plays to their racial sense and their sense of racial superiority, and he is amply rewarded for his servility and obsequiousness. In other words, Gabe is the typical sort of ever-ready, willing black servant who's cheerful about his subservience, right? And was the kind of black person that the Post regularly promoted as the desirable way to behave. On the other hand, the yellow-complected Harold represents African Americans' increasing demands for racial justice and civil rights in an era marked by the continued rise of Jim Crow. As the train continues north and crosses the Mason-Dixon line, Harold stops saying, "Thank ye, sir," and starts saying, "I thank you," which is a way of insisting on his own humanity. And he explains to Poindexter that he, Harold, is a part of a movement for greater rights. Quote, "He tells me he don't aim to let nobody run him over. He says he lives in a place called Jersey City where the colored race gets their bounden rights, and if they don't get them, they up and contends for them until they do," end quote. Cobb thus registers the effects of demographic changes, urbanization, and the new Negro movement through Harold. However, Cobb also immediately recontains these phenomena by portraying Harold as morally and ethically bankrupt. Cobb depicts Harold as a thief. Unlike Gabe, who earns tips by performing his servility and reifying his predetermined place in segregated America, Harold's proclaimed self-worth is undercut by his dishonorable actions. He makes his extra money by rifling through his passengers' pockets while they sleep. Cobb's incorporation of black petty thievery, which resurfaces prominently elsewhere in his novel, resonates with much of the dialect fiction in the Post, which emphasizes black criminality and moral inferiority. The Saturday Evening Post In the Saturday Evening Post, the corrupted motivations and behaviors of African American leaders was a standard trope, and portrayals of bad faith leadership acted to delegitimize any efforts for equality or justice. Right? Like, this is just something that comes up again and again and again. The idea that anybody who's a black leader of the community is in some way out for his own self-interest, is in some way bilking other people in the black community. It's a way to constantly delegitimize black leadership and black thought leadership. In other words, Harold's thievery, insolence, and moral turpitude undermine his insistence on his rights and self-worth and cast doubts on burgeoning new Negro activism and consciousness. Oh, yes, it'll be 20 minutes, I promise.
No worries.
Oh, I'm good? While preparing Cobb's novel for serial publication, Lorimer insisted on cutting scenes that further elaborated the trope of illegitimate black leadership, specifically Cobb's spoof of Marcus Garvey, as well as chapters that highlight the nascent African-American film industry. In a letter to the author, Lorimer explains that these elements slowed the novel's action too much. Pardon me. But I also suspect that Lorimer found the scenes perhaps too sympathetic to black political thought and industry, but I cannot adequately support the suspicion. Nonetheless, these elements of Cobb's novel warrant consideration. After Poindexter has moved to New York and begins to frequent Harlem, he encounters a character clearly based on Garvey. Quote, Gabriel, the black prophet of Abyssinia, is a great big overbearing-looking man, just overflowing with noble large words, end quote. Gabriel came to New York with a mission. Quote, the plan as he preaches it is that all us black folks everywhere must straightway rise ourselves up and follow after him, which he will then lead us back to our original own country of Africa, where he will cause all the white folks which have settled there to pull out and leave us in sole charge for to run our own government and be a free and independent people from thenceforth on forever, end quote. Gabriel promotes this plan by requiring his followers to pay monthly dues in order to build up a fleet of ships, a direct allusion to Garvey's ill-fated Black Star Line, which was in the news while Cobb was preparing his manuscript. Poindexter's discussions with his Harlem friends about the Black Prophet of Abyssinia afford Cobb opportunities to mock the idea of African heritage and the sincerity of black leadership. In this way, Cobb registers the rise of Pan-Africanism in the U.S. and then recontains this element of black international modernity by recycling standard minstrel tropes and affirming the rectitude of white dominance over non-whites globally. Lorimer also cut chapters that detail Poindexter's involvement in the film industry. A number of Cobb's stories had already been adapted for the screen by the time he published J. Poindexter Colored, and he had acted in 2 films. So Cobb draws on his own experiences when his narrator encounters and critiques the movie business. Having an opportunity to visit an uptown studio, Poindexter watches a white actor in blackface and mutters to himself that the actor and his director, quote, don't neither one of them understand the least particle about nigger actions and nigger deportment. The studio boss overhears this critique, and he quickly convinces Poindexter to take the actor's role and play the waiter himself. Before long, the white executive considers producing all-black 2-reel comedies for distribution to the 3 or 4,000 houses being run by colored people and being played for colored people, end quote. Another aside, sorry, but there's so many stories about the black film industry in the Saturday Evening Post that you don't see really elsewhere in Harlem Renaissance literature, and this is an aspect that I'm really fascinated by. Poindexter approves of this plan and urges the studio boss to focus primarily on comedies and to avoid questions of racial injustice and inequality. Poindexter tells the executive, quote, and whatever else you does, don't mess with no race problem. We get mighty, I can't do this stuff. We get mighty tired sometimes of being treated like the way we often is. Take my own case. I ain't no problem as a person. I craves to be so regarded, and that's the way I always has been regarded by my own kind of white folks down where I come from, end quote. So it's another, he's saying we can just make funny comedies. Throughout Cobb's novel and the larger corpus of black dialect fiction in the Post generally, a standard refrain is that Southern whites, especially those who come from former slaveholding families, best understand African Americans and know how to treat them properly. In other words, Cobb's novel implies that there is no need to worry about race in the U.S. because benevolent Southerners are already treating African Americans just fine. By excising Cobb's chapters on the film industry and on Garvey, Lorimer cut some of the material that deals most directly and extensively with urban black modernity and competing ideas about African American self-determination and self-expression. It would be tempting and convenient to suggest that Lorimer did so because he wanted to diminish the very small efforts Cobb makes to humanize and deepen his black characters. But again, I have no direct evidence for this. I looked at his letters and I don't find anything suggesting the motivation behind cutting stuff. After the deleted sections, J. Poindexter Colored returns its focus to the perilous situation of Jeff's white employer, Dallas Pulliam, and the novel draws inexorably toward Poindexter's clever manipulation of his boss's tormentors. Poindexter saves the day by warding off the dangerous Yankees who are scamming Pulliam, and Poindexter does so by playing on their northern preconceptions about southern family life and behaviors. Undoubtedly, the most clever and perceptive character in Cobb's novel is not any of the white people, but rather its African-American first-person narrator. Ultimately, however, Poindexter's most valued form of intelligence is not his ability to understand people's motivations and intentions, but his firm belief in the validity of the racial hierarchy and the inviolability of the color line. As the novel concludes, Poindexter is planning to stay in New York to start his own business, but he promises to remain faithful to his white folks in Paducah. Quote, "Tell the judge that if he finds the home place ain't running to suit him without me on hand to help look after his comfort, why all he's got to do is just let me know and I'll catch the next train for home." End quote. Poindexter's first alliance will always be to his white boss, not to himself. He promises Dallas Pulliam that, unlike, quote, "the new issued colored, who forgets favor and breaks pledges and sometimes turns and bites the hand which has fed and fondled him, Poindexter is continuing to quote, "is one shiny black nigger just rearing to prove the contrary wise," end quote. As Poindexter bids Pulliam farewell in the final pages, he promises, when I meet with one of my own kind of white folks in these parts, or when I goes back again amongst my own folks down below the line, I'll know my place and my station, and I'll respect them both. And I'll be just the same plain, regular old J. Poindexter Colored, which you always has known. Right? No matter how high he goes, he won't get too far. He won't go too far. Last paragraph. In his introductory essay to The New Negro, Elaine Locke describes the Old Negro as more of a myth than a man and more of a formula than a human being. And he is surely including characters such as Cobb's Jeff Poindexter, who knows his place and his station in this critique. Texts such as J. Poindexter Colored and the Saturday Evening Post white-authored black dialects fiction in general work to normalize and sustain white supremacy, and they inform the cultural context that the Harlem Renaissance writers engaged and challenged. I want to close by borrowing from Langston Hughes with suggesting that understanding how figures such as Cobb and Lorimer built the racial mountain of Jim Crow through the soft power of black dialect fiction, we can further appreciate how the black modernists of the New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance expressed their individual dark-skinned selves, built their temples for tomorrow, and struggled to free themselves from pervasive cultural manifestations of white supremacy. Thanks.